This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 31, Syagris. Blood oozed down into her grip as Undine wrenched her halberd free from the lifeless corpse of a Huscarian soldier. She looked down at the man. No, a boy. These were no hardened warriors. They were simply the closest troops available on such short notice. Border patrol, foot soldiers that marched in pretty lines on the edge of a peaceful country. But against farmers and circus performers, they were a deadly force. The sound of clinking armor in her direction forced Undine to swivel on her heel, lifting her weapon in defense. As another soldier fell dead at the end of her halberd, she noticed the purple mist fading from the battlefield, and the illusions of undead soldiers popped out of existence. She heaved a worried sigh. Not good. She wasn't given long to reflect on the moment, as a shout of victory erupted from the enemy side, and Undine glanced to the west. Cavalry. 30 or so horses, outfitted in battle armor and spikes. Border patrol or not, these beasts would simply trample them. But they hadn't come unprepared. They had an armored beast of their own. She located the miniature dwarf and charged towards him, striking out with her bloody weapon as she went. The loss of the mists and their illusions didn't bode well for the Arcanist or the king. The grip on his sword loosened when Errik felt a tremor ripple through him. What gave him the idea that this asinine plan of his would actually succeed? Why had they thought this would work? Even with half of the enemy ranks sent screaming in fear, they were still outnumbered 3-1. He glanced down at Atlas, motionless and still at his feet. One of his only friends in this world. "It's all my fault." The words had barely left him when Errik looked up in time to catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. He spun to see a soldier of the Brotherhood had broken through the line, swinging an axe in his direction. Stumbling back, Errik moved his hand to block with his sword. The strike nearly knocked the blade from his grip as the soldier stepped in, bringing the weapon back around. He tried to retaliate with his own sword, but the monk hooked the blade with his axe and ripped it free. Errik felt his breath leave him in a rush as he felt the enemy's weapon connect with his chest. The impact crumpled him to the ground, gasping for air. His mind raced as he clawed at the gaping wound, the gash spilling his wool padding. He looked down to see that the ridiculous outfit borrowed from Bozehill had been overstuffed to the point where the fabric had actually saved him. His moment of victory was short-lived as he looked up to see the monk raising his axe for another attack. His sword lay feet from him, and he raised his hands in a pitiful, unarmed defense. There was a rush of wind and a blast of heat that singed the ends of Errik's hair. He watched in horror as the Brotherhood monk was set into a flailing, screaming fit as flames shrouded his black robes. "You're supposed to be protecting me," Atlas coughed, collapsing back into a prone position in the ash. Errik scrambled to his hands and knees, turning around to see the Arcanist had pulled himself up on one elbow, his free hand clutching at the arrow protruding from his gut. "You're alive!" Atlas grimaced as he shifted once more. "And you're an idiot! That was a little uncalled for." Errik frowned, some of his euphoria fading from him. "Is it?" Atlas let out a wheeze. "You're a mage. Why would you be using a sword?"
"He has a point."
Errik rolled his eyes and climbed to his feet, throwing out a hand to offer the Arcanist help up. "Think you're up for recasting your spells?" Atlas swooned, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. "Not a chance. I nearly blacked out after casting that fireball." He groaned as he waved off the gesture. "You're gonna have to get out there and fix this on your own, before it gets any worse." Errik stopped to pick up his sword, considering it for a moment before returning his focus to the Arcanist. "What about you?" Atlas shifted once more, dragging himself on his good side. "I'll find one of the Fae to help me out of here. Now go!" Errik nodded. Self-pity wasn't going to save anyone. He could hate himself later. "And another thing." Atlas leveled a finger at the False King. "Make sure Barry gets out of this alive, yeah?" A small smile tugged at his face as Errik turned, scanning the battlefield for the giant bear. He spotted him in the distance, scattering troops and spooking horses. "I don't think that will be a problem." Barry belted out a terrible roar, saliva spraying from his yellowing teeth. Soldiers and horses fled from his horrific visage. Spurred on by this, he chased them down with not one, but 2 riders on his back. Bears are swift creatures when they need to be, but he would never be a match for a horse at full gallop. But catching them had not been Undine's intent. Spooking them enough for them to buck their riders had been. She clung to the bear's back with her legs, swinging her halberd at anything that got within reach. She kept a close eye on the tiny dwarf, as he laughed maniacally, tossing flash arrows at random into the throngs of soldiers. Together, they sowed considerable chaos, breaking the enemy line with explosions of light and weapons. A dozen riders had been dismounted, and several more were clinging for dear life to the back of fear-stricken beasts as they fled the battlefield. Any soldiers or riders that made it past found themselves at the mercy of Goran and Nadija. The 2 Goliaths were like literal stone walls, impeding riders and causing them to turn aside. Those that made the mistake of charging them head-on were roughly introduced to the ashen earth of the battlefield. Ruby snorted, gritting her teeth as she pulled her horse around. She dug her spurs into its side, sending it into a gallop. She tugged hard at the reins, maneuvering her beast into a group of Fuscarian soldiers, putting distance between herself and the bear. Looking over her shoulder, she could see the lumbering beast plow through the mounted cavalry in an attempt to catch her. Ruby let out a shrill laugh as she slammed the end of her spiked bat onto the armored rump of her horse, sending it into a full panic. It let out a strangled cry of fear and kicked back at whatever had just attacked it, before lunging into an all-out, terror-fueled run. A flash of purple caught her attention, and she whipped around in time to see the ram-skull Goliath reaching out for her with a massive hand. Ruby tightened her grip around her bat, letting loose a growl as she swung it high, shattering a couple of fingers into dust. Her horse skirted around the other stone giant and landed them directly into the fray. She couldn't fight back the giggle that erupted from within as bodies of soldiers and undead alike were trampled beneath the hooves of her beast. She narrowed her eyes, scanning the battlefield for a sign of her quarry. A manic grin pulled at her lips as her gaze landed on a figure clad in pink. At the sound of hooves clashing into the ashen earth, Pyra turned to see a rider charging towards her. Too late, she noticed the weapon, raised high above the rider's head, and she moved to dodge the attack. She stumbled over the corpse of a soldier and felt Ruby's weapon connect with her arm. A terrible pain seared through her as steel spikes tore into her flesh, and Pyra felt the bones snap as the force of the blow knocked her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, and her teeth bit into her tongue. Tears stung her vision as she managed to roll onto her side. The crazed Jewel was turning her steed for another pass, her weapon held high once more. That smile never wavered from Ruby's face as she narrowed her focus on the Queen. Today, she would end this little monarch, squash this petty resistance, and remind the people of Ebra that the Brotherhood would reign supreme. She yanked back on her reins, hard, and slammed her bat into the horse's backside. It reared angrily before bolting into action. Certain she would meet her end here, Pyra closed her eyes and braced for the pain. A guttural animal cry and the panicked whinny of a horse caused her to open them almost immediately. She blinked away the tears in time to see the Minotaur, Teakettles, his horns lowered as he gored into the horse's side. The power and speed of his charge sent the steed and its rider into the ash and dirt of the battlefield. Ruby cried out in pain as she struggled to free her leg from the dead steed. She looked up in time to see the Minotaur stalking towards her, both sets of horns drenched in horseblood. The smeared makeup on his face did little to hide the murder in his eyes as he rounded on her. Teakettles reached out and plucked the small woman from beneath the corpse of her horse and held her high. Her feet dangled and kicked out uselessly as she struggled to pry open his fingers. He chanced to glance over his shoulder to see that Boeshill was at the Queen's side, pulling her from danger. He let out a snort of approval, turning back to the so-called jewel. But a blinding pain collided with his head, and he relinquished the woman as he crumpled to his knees.
"I have had enough of you, filthy animals!"
Ruby screamed as she reared back her arm, her bat poised for the kill.
"Leave him alone!"
Through the rage that filled her, Ruby looked up to see the Arcanist held aloft in the arms of a terrified dryad. She scoffed as she sunk the heel of her boot into the Minotaur's head, sprawling him out on the ground.
"Well, if it ain't Mr. Handsome."
She lowered her bat and sauntered over towards him.
"Ready to take me up on that offer? I've got the perfect job for that face of yours."
She gave him a slow wink. Atlas pulled a look of disgust before spitting on the ground.
"Not if I was blindfolded and you had a bag on your head."
He waved his hand through the air in an aimless gesture, trying to buy time for Teakettles to crawl away.
"Besides, you know what they say about keeping your business out of crazy."
She felt a muscle twitch beneath her eye, and Ruby let out a long growl of frustration. She heaved her weapon, and before the terrified dryad could flee, she sank the spiked end of it into the back of its head. It collapsed, spilling Atlas to the ground. Ruby stepped over the dead hunk of wood and straddled the Arcanist, planting herself on his chest.
"Last chance, sugar, or you end up like that one there."
She used the tip of her bat to force him to look at the dryad. Pale, dead green eyes looked back at him. Oozing sap leaked from the gaping wound in the back of its head, pooling beneath its face. Atlas's heart ached to see such a sad thing. Dryads were creatures of the forest. They were life magic in living form, more plant than animal. In a way, it wasn't dead, just returning to the earth. And where it died, new growth would spring. He could see life popping up in the pool of green sap already. Blades of grass and tiny flowers had begun to sprout. An oasis in a field of death. A flash of pain coursed through him, and Atlas nearly blacked out as he returned his attention to the jewel still perched atop him, fiddling with his arrow shaft.
"Although you might not last long, being gut shot and all."
Atlas swallowed hard, pushing aside the pain and forcing his mind to focus.
"Can I say something first?"
Ruby raised a brow.
"Last words, huh? All right, I suppose."
The Arcanist began to mumble something at length, so she leaned forward to listen. Nonsense words that meant nothing to her, until she noticed the glowing runes he was scrawling in the air at his fingertips. She clicked her tongue against her teeth and sent her fist into his face.
"Nice try, handsome, but I don't think so."
Using his tongue to fish around for the loose tooth in his mouth, Atlas spat it out,
Thanks. I wasn't sure how I was going to break that spell on my own. Your timing is impeccable.
He smiled, nodding his head at something behind the woman. An unearthly, ear-splitting roar blew Ruby's hair over her shoulder, and she turned to see a massive plant beast, still growing in size. It peeled back its sepals for another cry before she felt a thick vine wrap around her middle. Atlas let out a small laugh as the plant beast launched the jewel of the Brotherhood into the air and swallowed her with a comically loud gulp. At the clamor of the soldiers, the plant beast lumbered off into the fray, leaving him alone in the field next to the corpse of a dryad. A transmogrified horror may not be the rebirth it had expected, but hopefully it would have approved of the sacrifice. He let out a long sigh as he noticed the bodies of other circus and fae folk surrounded him. It would seem, he thought, that the false king had not managed any magical saving graces. The pain he had pushed aside crashed back into him, and he slipped off into unconsciousness, imagining what the enshrined wilds were like this time of year, and if he would ever get to see them. Errik threw himself in front of a tiny fawn, shielding them as a sword came crashing down against his back. The blade shattered against the black cloud that clung to his skin, and he spun, sinking a fist into the soldier's gut. They landed some 20 feet away, motionless on the ground. The black mist receded, forming back into a shadow at his feet, and the fawn gave him an appreciative nod before sprinting away in the opposite direction.
Wraith, how are you holding up?
Tired, but better than you.
Starting to shake with effort, Errik gave a weak nod. Between the two of them, they constantly monitored and tracked his reserves of energy and managed to minimize his usage of it. So far, it was working. He spotted another fae caught off guard and leapt forward, snapping Wraith's shell up around his fist. He connected with the enemy's jaw and sent the Brotherhood monk into a spin before falling unconscious to the ground.
We can't keep this up.
We have to.
Errik felt his teeth chatter, despite the heat and sweat dripping from his brow.
These people are here because of me. I can't let them down.
If we keep going, you'll die.
And if that happens, then you jump to someone else and ride them out of here. I'm not stopping.
Errik stumbled forward and caught another monk by the back of their tunic, tearing them away from the Selkie they were fighting and tossing him backward.
I can't stop.
Fine. Be stubborn.
How could his shadow bug consider this an act of stubbornness? Errik looked around. Dead bodies littered the ground at his feet. Everywhere. Gruesome last moments of fear permanently etched into their faces. It wasn't romantic or exciting. It was horrendous. All because a group of stuffy diplomats wanted to play power games. Am I any better? He thought. He was the one who had convinced them to follow his lead into this bloodbath.
Look out!
Unable to react in time, something heavy impacted Erik's side, and even though Wraith had managed to save him, the force of it knocked him to the ground. A large, muscular man in shining blue-trimmed armor stood over him, a heavy warhammer in his hand. The man cried out and brought the weapon down once more. Wraith's shell was smaller than before, but it covered him in time to deaden the attack. Pinned down by the soldier's relentless strikes, Errik struggled until he got one knee under himself and brought his fist up as he stood, uppercutting the man in the sternum. The soldier was launched off his feet, but not nearly as far as he should have gone. Ready to thank his shadow bug for the save, Errik stopped when he heard terrified shouting. To his left, he spotted several of Bozhill's goblins, standing back to back, fending off a group of monks with whatever they could scavenge from around them. Checking his reserves, Errik felt his shade was dangerously low. He hoped it was enough, and he lunged forward, throwing a wild punch at the closest attacker. It connected with the man's arm, but he felt his wrist buckle painfully.
You what?
The soldier turned to him with a surprised look of mild indignation. Errik's mouth fell open as stark realization crashed over him. He couldn't feel Wraith in his mind. Too focused on the sudden hollow feeling radiating throughout his body, he didn't take notice as the soldier slammed a metal fist into his face, shattering his glasses and sending him to the ground. Blind fingers scoured the ash around him until they landed on something small.
No, 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 no!
He wrapped his hands around the tiny, limp form of Wraith. Unwilling to use what little shade Errik had left, the shadowbug had sacrificed himself. The world around him went deaf as he nudged the tiny figure with his fingers.
Wraith?
Nothing. Without enough shade energy, the creature could no longer hold on to its ethereal form. A swarm of hands grabbed hold of Errik, struggling to pull him roughly off the ground. Rage and desperation replaced despair over the loss of his friend. He lashed out with what little energy he had left, using the physical contact of his aggressors as a conduit. Just like Wraith had drained the soul of a tree to heal him, he drained these men, pouring their essence into the still bug in his hand. One after another, his attackers fell as he siphoned off their souls. There was a noise in his ear, but he continued, his heartbeat too loud to recognize words.
I said stop!
Like the crashing of waves on rocks, the world around Errik slammed back into motion. His vision, blurred from the loss of his glasses, regained focus. Wraith? The shadowbug was no longer in his hand.
You shouldn't have done that.
Stumbling back a step, Errik had to admit he felt better than he had in days. But it came at a cost. At his feet lay the shriveled, mummified corpses of soldiers and monks. His stomach flipped over as a sickening feeling pulled him to his knees. He stared at the result of his actions in horror, his gaze moving from body to body, only to see those of the goblins felled by swords. Tears rolled down his face. The gravity of this war weighed heavy on him. After such a monstrous act, he couldn't even save them. He wasn't that man, was he?
Get up!
What's the point? Errik hung his head, defeated at last. We can't win this. An earth-shattering rumble pulled him from his apathetic stupor, and he looked around. The body of a ginormous plant beast lay dead nearby, purple sap spreading from a gaping wound in what could be considered its torso. Ruby slid free from the beast, her tightly curled locks stained violet, and her neat armor hung loose over her body. She dragged her bat behind her as she limped away from her fresh kill, but the manic smile on her face brightened as she spotted the king, slouching on the ground near the corpses of several soldiers.
Tears?
Ha! She scoffed. You know, Sugar, you really...
Shut up!
Errik pushed himself to his feet, narrowing his eyes at her as he did. He glanced at the goblins once more. They had fought to the end, despite the odds. He owed it to them to do the same.
You with me, Wraith?
Always.
Errik closed the gap between himself and Ruby. His shadow rose into a black mist that coalesced around his body, armoring him for battle. He cocked back his fist and let it fly, but she simply danced away from him. He swiveled, aiming another punch in her direction. She sidestepped it easily, and he felt something slam into the back of his head. The impact sent him to his knees, far more powerful than the warhammer had been. Confusion set in as Errik frowned. Someone that small should not be able to hit that hard. Unless Wraith was losing power. He reached around to the back of his head. There was no blood, but it sure smarted.
Wraith, are you okay?
Yes, but she hits really hard.
As if to prove the point, Ruby reached down, spinning the little king to face her direction.
I want you to look me in the eye when I end your life.
She raised her bat, swinging it down like a sledgehammer to crush him. Errik rolled hard to the side, but he couldn't do so fast enough. Her weapon caught him in the shoulder, and even though Wraith's shield absorbed most of the attack, he felt it tear into the skin. The impact against Wraith's armor shattered the bat into splinters, and he nearly blacked out from the pain.
What the hell is going on?
Tossing the severed handle away, Ruby sighed dramatically and reached down to grab him, but it was like trying to grab a fish.
I could ask you the same thing, sugar.
She finally managed to grasp a hold of his ridiculous garb and hoist him to his feet. A smile broke across her face.
But think about it. Like you said, we ain't from here. And with all the wonderful gadgets in all the worlds, why in tarnation would you think I wanted to have a few toys from back home?
As she closed her fingers to make a fist, Errik heard it. A low whirring, and the scraping of metal plates against each other. It sounded exactly the same as his brother's mechanical arm. Power armor! Now he understood how she was doing all that she had done, and why the Brotherhood had sent her to lead the charge. It wasn't even remotely fair. But his moment of realization was short-lived as she slammed her armored fist into his already tender nose. Hot blood spurted across his face, and he collapsed to the ground when she relinquished her grip on him. Riddled with pain, he was unable to avoid her boot as she stomped him hard enough in the chest to crater the earth beneath him.
Can't keep this up forever. You need to get up.
Errik threw out a hand, a feeble attempt to stop her from crushing him, when something tackled her to the ground. He heard a howl of rage and wiped the blood from his eyes to see Bob clawing at her armor, his bony fingers like talons in an attempt to rip her limb from limb. Ruby cursed as she struggled beneath the king's rotting servant, attempting to free herself. A scream tore through her as she felt the corpse's jagged fingernails rake across her face.
Get this stinking undead off me!
She howled in rage before finding her footing and shoved the rabid beast off her. Errik managed to pull himself up in time to see the jewel slam Bob into the ground before using a nearby spear to pin him in place. The undead writhed in a blind fury, a purple rage still flickering in his eyes. He began to pull himself towards her, groaning angrily as his body began to separate around the stake. He wanted to order Bob to stop, to tell him to leave her alone, but hesitation halted Erik's movements and thoughts. He was forced to watch in horror as Ruby reached down and wrenched the undead forward, ripping him in two, dropping his upper torso to the ground in favor of the discarded warhammer.
Golf sure ain't my game of choice, but I'm sure we can improvise.
Ruby shrugged, lowering the hammer and lining it up with the undead creature's head.
Stop hurting my friends!
Errik lurched into action, clasping his hands together in a tight bear hug and pinning her arms to her sides. A string of curses left Ruby's lips as she dropped the warhammer and pried at the grip around her chest.
Hurt them? Oh, honey, no. I'm gonna do so much more than hurt them. I'm gonna slit the throats of everyone you have ever met.
She let out a hysterical laugh.
All you had to do was die, and you couldn't even do that right.
As Errik struggled to hold her tight, a calm fury slid over him. He had given her the chance to avoid this mess, to avoid this battle, but greed and hatred had won the day. And now, this famous battlefield was once again strewn with the dead. He finally understood Elias, how someone could be driven to do what he had done. He closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, feeling the edges of her soul. He whispered slowly into her ear as he tightened his grip. There are worse things than death. Maybe he was that man. Fear replaced that manic smile on Ruby's face, and she opened her mouth to scream, but her voice was stolen from her, and only a dry gurgle came out. A rapid sensation of dehydration flooded her body as it began to crumble from within. Her golden curls grayed at the tips, and her vision clouded. And in her core, she understood. This wasn't death. This was the end of being. Despite her weakening attempts to get away, Errik held fast and continued to bleed the jewel of the Brotherhood dry. He glanced up to see Bob staring back at him. The purple haze lifted from his eyes. The creature was fearful and putting distance between them, shoving himself away like a scorned puppy. A sickening feeling washed over Errik, and he relinquished Ruby with a snap. She fell forward into the ash with a wheezing gasp for air. The shame at what he had done sunk in, and it revolted him to his core. He had been horrified when Wraith drained a tree of its life, and she would have been his fourth victim today. The others had been an act of grief, of desperation. He could argue even an accident. But this? He stepped back, fighting the urge to vomit. This was intentional, and he couldn't become that man, no matter the cost. Bang! Errik felt something hot sear into his shoulder, and pain exploded out. Ripped from his moment of self-disgust, he faltered and buckled to one knee, blood dripping from the gaping wound. He looked up to see Ruby, white as a ghost, holding a small pistol leveled at him with a shaking hand. Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
You there, soldier.
Yes, sir?
Why aren't you down there in the battle with the others? You're a Fuscarian soldier. They need you, man.
Oh, say, I wish I could, but I'm deathly allergic to bears.
Allergic to bears?
Yup. If I even get within 100 feet of a bear, I'll just keel over dead. Been that way since I was a lad.
That's no excuse. You should be out there laying down your life for king and country. I order you to leave.
Nope. It's a medical allowance.
A what?
The military cannot force me to do anything that would trigger a pre-existing life-threatening condition.
Wait, really? You two, why aren't you out in the front line? Allergies, sir.
Yep, what he said.
Fine, carry on. Damned medical allowances.